you're finding all of the forums today at Innovation Zero very informative as well. Hope you're able to connect those words of sustainability and what does it mean? What does it mean for ESG frameworks? What does it mean for climate risks, transition risks, physical risks, sustainable financing, carbon markets, and net zero? Let's try and bring that all together and talk about hydrogen. Blue, brown, grey, maybe rainbow-coloured hydrogen as well. Lots of different types of hydrogen. So I'd like to invite on the stage Georgina, William, and Eugene as well, who are going to tell us and talk to us, how do we deliver carbon capture storage? How do we enable that? And how do we scale as well? And then we're also going to end the day with 2 more sessions. So hold on to your seats. Don't disappear after that. We're going to have James Alexander. He's going to be talking about the financing aspect from UK SIF. But enough from me blithering on. Let me hand over to Georgina. Please give them a round of applause as well.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this session on delivering CCS-enabled hydrogen at scale. So as Rav mentioned, I'm Georgina Katzaros, and I'm Policy Manager at the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, or CCSA, as some of you may know us as. And we are the leading trade association in the UK and the EU for the commercial deployment of CCUS. So we have a wide breadth of members who all we support in their delivery of commercial CCUS projects, both in the UK and in the EU. But we're here today to discuss CCS-enabled hydrogen, and as I'm sure many of you will already know from earlier sessions, government have put forward their targets that we need to be net zero by 2050, and in all of the modelling pathways for us to get there, hydrogen plays a really critical and key role. So I'm going to introduce you to my panelists today. If I can ask you to introduce yourselves, a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and why you're interested in CCS-enabled hydrogen.
Thank you. I'm Joyce. I'm Innovation Lead for Industrial Decarbonisation at UKRI. I'm Technical Lead for a £210 million programme which is investing in the FEED studies for the major CCS projects in the UK. So we have 9 deployment projects within 5 industrial clusters, and we have some major CCUS-enabled hydrogen projects as part of that mix. So I'm hoping to be able to touch upon some of the highlights and case studies of that today.
Thanks, Will.
Hi, I'm Eugene McKenna. I'm VP Hydrogen and Sustainable Technologies at Johnson Matthey. Johnson Matthey's an old British company. It's 200 years old. Our mission is to catalyse the journey to net zero in the world for society and for customers. With that in mind, we're really a process technology and chemicals company, and we have the chemical toolkit that does the practical things that will enable the world go on that route to net zero. So, for example, we have technology for green hydrogen, for PEM electrolysis, the components, as well as using that hydrogen in fuel cells in the UK. We have a toolkit around e-ammonia, e-methanol, cracking ammonia, sustainable aviation fuel, and of most interest for this conversation, blue hydrogen. So looking at those industrial clusters around the UK, the Johnson Matthey technology is being selected for the most advanced of those projects. It's kind of tried and tested technology as it's being deployed elsewhere over the last 40 years in things like methanol, so delivering lowest cost, lowest carbon content hydrogen. And just thinking about this morning and thinking about the projects in Teesside and being in the UK, Teesside has the prospect of being the only hydrogen valley in the world where the technology being deployed in the valley in the UK will actually have been designed and developed and invented in that cluster.
Thanks, Eugene. Sticking with projects, Will, maybe I'll go to you first. In your role in UKRI, maybe you could give us a bit of a scene setter on current government targets for CCS-enabled hydrogen, projects in the pipeline, and you know, are those feasible to get deployed by 2030?
Yeah, so in terms of where we are, so the UK was the first major economy to develop a hydrogen strategy. This outlined a twin-track approach towards hydrogen production. So the idea was that we don't talk about green versus blue anymore. We move away from that debate, and we talk about low carbon hydrogen and compliance with the low carbon hydrogen standards. So that's a greenhouse gas emissions intensity standard on hydrogen production. I think it's quite a sensible way to move forward in terms of we're no longer talking about whether green or blue is better. We're just talking about low carbon hydrogen projects. In terms of policy, the 10-point plan that was Boris Johnson's response to a green industrial revolution and bounce back to COVID. That outlined a 5 gigawatt production target by 2030. That was then doubled to 10 gigawatts. We're now talking about 1 gigawatt production by 2025. In terms of funding, there's the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which is a £240 million package to address a pipeline of projects and bringing a pipeline of projects forward so that they're all at different stages of development in order to meet those targets. And then we've got the developing business models, the CFDs. So in terms of policy, I think we're in a really strong position as a country. So that focus is on production and primary off-takers. So usually that's industrial applications which are quite close to a production unit. So the idea is that we develop these the idea is that we focus on production and then these primary off-takers close to the production unit. And then later on we'll start to think about those broader applications for hydrogen, developing those broader regional economies, thinking about other applications for hydrogen as well. So I think, in terms of what we can offer from a CCUS perspective, hydrogen produced from natural gas deployed in parallel with CCS, we can really create these scalable business models. We can first decarbonize our industrial sites, and then we can lay the foundations for broader regional hydrogen applications and economies. And just, sticking on the point of policy, I mean, just whilst I was thinking about what to say today, I looked internationally. I looked at France. They've got a 6 gigawatt production target by 2030. Germany have a 10 gigawatt electrolytic target by 2030. And then you can compare that with the UK. So we've got a 10 gigawatt target, but that's low carbon hydrogen. That also includes CCS-Enabled hydrogen. That's something that France and Germany don't have available to them. And we can really leverage, our CCS projects, which are developing this decade. They're in quite advanced stages of project planning. They'll become operational. They'll begin construction and operation in the mid to late 2020s. And hydrogen produced, in parallel with CCS production, really does set us apart from our continental neighbours. And it's that asset that we have in the UK, that we have in our continental shelf, the ability to be able to store CO2 in geological rock formation in perpetuity under the ground in aquifers and disused gas fields. And we've got 4 industrial clusters which have access to viable offshore CO2 storage sites. And it's this tremendous asset that we can really leverage to kickstart the UK economy. And if we go back to green versus blue, I mean, without being too controversial, blue is perhaps an easier way to kickstart this process, and then green might be an ultimate way forwards. I'm sure different people have different opinions on that, but the point really is that the fact that we can leverage blue hydrogen really does set us apart from our continental neighbours that have those production targets.
Thanks, Phil. I think it's a really good point. We very easily, I think, sometimes in our race to deploy can forget just how far we've actually come already. So Eugene, maybe your reflections on that, comparing us to other international frameworks, how do you think the UK is doing in terms of our CCS?
I think the UK has been admirably apolitical and science-based in setting its targets. So the objective that was set was how do you most quickly get to net zero and start the journey to net zero. And I think as countries in general, there was a wave of countries with the UK at the forefront of it, coming up with a target to get to net zero. Then as soon as you have a target, you need a plan to get to net zero. as soon as you have a plan, you realize you need hydrogen, because so much of the energy ecosystem that we have today is mediated by molecules, not just electrons, something we're going to try and change. But there are still areas of the energy ecosystem that will be very difficult to decarbonize or decarbonize quickly with electrons. And that's where hydrogen will really be required. So the UK has focused on just getting that low carbon hydrogen with the focus on the low carbon, for which they needed standards. So they've been at the forefront of setting standards that were absolutely focused not on the source of the hydrogen, but on the nature of the hydrogen that was produced. It's whether, and the focus, in other words, the focus on the emissions rather than the focus on the hydrogen that was produced at the end, which I think is very wise. So I think if I step back more widely and look at the framework, clearly nobody is going fast enough. So lots of people are doing good work. Most people involved in hydrogen would like it to go quicker, but we've got to bring all of society with us in order to make it go quicker. And if I look, kind of thinking of the subtleties of that, clearly in the United States, there's been a rash of activity, famously around the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's, I guess also where ideology and politics gets into things, because most of the incentives, and there's been a rush to invest in the United States, are around production of hydrogen, much more so than its consumption. And I think actually some projects after the initial rush are now having their own issues, because, as well as producing, you really need people to consume. And it's always easier to get an outcome. And, if you've got two potential levers, it's easier to fine-tune things with two levers rather than one. So Europe has a much more subtle framework, not as generous financially as the United States, but it is focusing on both offtake and production of hydrogen. And it may be that they get further with less money than the United States does with lots of money. So I think they've all got things to say for them that are positive, including that most people involved in it want more of it and want it all to come together. And I think as well in that respect, we've got to remember here we're talking about completely overhauling the entire energy infrastructure of the world. And it feels a little bit like, a lot of it's a planned economy approach to things. It's quite Soviet in nature. There's a 5-year plan for hydrogen, and it's, there's that famous apocryphal perhaps story of Gorbachev sending one of his folks to Thatcher's Britain to see what went well during, Glasnost. And the thing he was most impressed by was that there weren't any queues for bread. And so what he wanted to do was meet the person who planned bread supply to London, and just couldn't get his head around the fact that nobody was in charge of bread supply to London. So I think where we are at the moment is that planned economy. It's planning hydrogen supply, you supply it, you consume it. I think if we worked back from where we need to be by 2050, we need to be at that point where nobody needs to plan it, because it's got the regulation and the standards in place that make market economics make the world go round.
Yeah, and I think that's just it. Having that plan, you need to have market certainty, particularly for a technology like hydrogen, where it's not something we've seen in the UK before. So I think there are more increased risks in terms of investability in the technology. So perhaps one for both of you, what do you sort of see in your roles as the key challenges? What do you come across when you're working on these hydrogen projects as challenges to being able to deploy?
I think, I'd like to take an example of one of the projects that we fund in terms of, I suppose let's go with HyNet. I mean, we've in the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge Programme, we've invested £33 million in the HyNet project in the Northwest. And that project is centred around a hydrogen production unit at the Stanlow refinery, which SR Energy Transition, EET Fuels, HPP1, that'll result in a 350 megawatt capacity ATR technology, Johnson Matthey low carbon hydrogen technology, and it'll result in 30 terawatt hours of hydrogen production by 2030. I mean, that's from sort of a macro level, that's fantastic. But obviously we need off-takers to be able to supply that hydrogen to. Hydrogen is a vector, so you can fuel switch, you can vector shift towards hydrogen. So in terms of storage, then we need to develop salt cavern storage, and that's something that Innovin are looking at in the northwest in terms of developing. I think it's around 1.3 terawatt hours of hydrogen storage in the salt caverns. Cadent then are developing a hydrogen transmission network across the northwest cluster. And then there's also linking that up with the CCS pipeline as well, which will then take the CO2 from the hydrogen production and take that and store that out in the Liverpool Bay fields and the East Irish Sea. So it's a case of everything needs to come together. And in terms of time frames, in terms of these projects, you've got a number of different partners which are all working together. And I think that's one of the real pros of the industrial cluster level funding, is that all these partners with their own interests and own commercial avenues have all had to come together with this common goal of decarbonising their cluster. So I think for me, in terms of challenges, I'm looking at a high-level challenge here, but it's bringing all these partners together to ensure that we can deliver that and then reach that 2030 target of 30 terawatt hours, because it's hugely ambitious. And talking back to that 10 gigawatt target that I spoke about earlier, that's a hugely ambitious target, and we need all these projects to be able to deliver in order to achieve that. So I think that's the biggest challenge for me.
Yeah, so that's a great project. I actually started my career in an office that looked at the site where that blue hydrogen project is being built in a research centre across the way. So it's great to see a petrochemical plant being replaced by a clean hydrogen plant. But it's been a Herculean effort to bring together partners to close the loop on supplying the feedstocks, making the clean, low-carbon hydrogen, distributing it, storing it, and finding off-takers. And a Herculean effort by government and by the various people in the consortium who've been putting all of that together. And really, in truth, that's what makes it difficult, is that it's difficult to do parts of a project on their own, because you need all of them together before the whole thing makes sense. And if you were involved in a petrochemical project, you would know that you could buy your feedstock from a global market and potentially supply your product into a global market, and there would be rules, regulations. You would have no shortage of market information about what the prices would be to help you project finance such a project. So just at the moment with some of these projects, we're really getting the people together who can put the nuts and bolts in the ground. So, and not to focus on the UK, but there's still that uncertainty about exactly what the regulatory framework will be 10 years in advance, because people are building these projects with a 30-year lifetime and with economics that depend on growth as well. And there's just much more uncertainty. Not that there isn't uncertainty in the oil markets too, because who knows if those folks have a market for their product in 10 or 20 years' time as well. So, but definitely more uncertainty about that.
No, absolutely. So in your opinions, what do we need to do now then in order to be able to move ahead on those challenges and reduce that uncertainty? Are there key steps we can be taking today and into the next couple of years to reduce on that?
I think it's interesting, this panel is about CCS-enabled hydrogen. If you look at research priorities, there's a lot more research priorities for green hydrogen production. It's a lot harder in terms of, developing electrolyzers. I think, the key innovation as part of this technology is it's using pre-existing technology, but then deploying it at a scale that's never been done before. So it's the scale of deployment, which is something that we really need to deliver upon. And as we touched upon it, it's bringing together those many different partners that have those competing priorities to be able to do what they need to do to be able to decarbonise their industrial cluster, which is the real target of our funding in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainty and stability and regulatory frameworks are all good things for an investment environment. Thinking about the UK, I guess a few thoughts. It's all, the world is full of people trying to compete with each other, and the UK has some strategic competitive advantages geologically, for example. So it is the site of some of the best locations for carbon capture and storage in Europe. So, a competitive advantage. It is one of the windiest places in the world. It's also one of the best places with, developed salt caverns for hydrogen storage, which is the basis of the Industrial Revolution and chemical business in the UK many years ago. Actually, I think that with ambition, this could be a reason why the chemical industry that has been moving away from the UK, because it's not, advantaged from a location perspective for supply into global markets, could become an advantaged location again, and it's time to take advantage of that. I think with blue hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen from methane with carbon capture and storage, there's an opportunity to take advantage of that non-political, if you like, approach to low carbon hydrogen when Europe has been favouring green hydrogen. So blue hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen projects can immediately go to really serious global scale. So typically we can very quickly talk about gigawatt scale of hydrogen production using tried and tested technology, because reaction vessels of these size have been tried in production of industrial methanol projects before. So people can be sure it will work and that there will be large quantities of hydrogen. Now, the biggest projects people are talking about in green hydrogen at the moment, 100, 200 megawatts. So really an order of magnitude smaller. And some of the ones that are switched on are clearly have to deal with the fact that a project in 5 years' time might be much better. So how do you invest in something now when it might be usurped by something else in 5 years' time? Whereas if you invest in low carbon hydrogen, you've got technology that's approaching the best it's going to be. Clearly, the more things that we make, there will be incremental improvements. With rights laws, we manufacture more and more of these materials. So it's really in the infrastructure that the improvements are going to come there, I think, for low carbon hydrogen. But UK could really be a place to put it. So maybe an export opportunity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really interesting. So we've got a few questions coming in on Slido, and that links into one of them we've had. Somebody asking, why should we rely on natural gas to create hydrogen as a sustainable choice? And I think, like you say, using CCS-enabled hydrogen is actually paving the way for us to move to electrolytic hydrogen into the future. So once we've got the infrastructure up and running for CCS-enabled hydrogen, it will bring the costs down for us then to transition to green hydrogen, which we're not quite in a phase where we're ready to do yet. So you have to have that transition period where CCS-enabled hydrogen is going to be key in order for us to actually get to being able to have electrolytic hydrogen widespread at scale into the future. Your reflections there on that one?
Well, do you want to
yeah, I mean, it's we're talking about an energy transition, so we're talking about developing a number of robust different approaches to be able to move this forward, and it's a much more resilient energy mix if we have both blue and green hydrogen together. Blue hydrogen, so we're talking about our CCS network, so obviously we need access to a CCS network, and they're in industrial clusters, and there are a huge number of benefits as well that come with investing in industrial clusters in terms of driving an investment into perhaps classically underrepresented regions in the UK, boosting the competitiveness of these regions, green skills, workforce transition, keeping these industries alive. So in terms of that side of things, it's very clear that the benefits of investing in industrial clusters. And then on the other side of things as well, you need a renewable power source for green hydrogen production. The wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining. It's a lot harder to be able to rely just on green hydrogen production. So having that blue side of things as well, it creates a much more resilient mix that we can really utilise those assets that we have in the North Sea and that geological storage as well to be able to leverage this and create regional hydrogen economies.
So I think on that one, I think we often have a focus on net zero, but just as important is the carbon budget that we have to spend between now and getting to net zero. The more natural gas gets turned into low carbon hydrogen rather than being burnt, the less of our carbon budget that we're going to use. The European Union, amongst other places in the world, and Asia as well, is signing 20-year supply contracts for LNG, intending to burn that as LNG into the future. So if you have low carbon gas, if you have a cheap gas field that you can extract the gas from, if you can turn that into hydrogen and put the carbon dioxide back in there, it's diffused. It's never going to end up as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I think it's very difficult to ask and to imagine a world in which major resource holding companies are going to leave cheap, easily accessible gas in the ground over the next 20, 30 years, as long as there's a market for that gas, for burning it. And I think some of the great ways to that are turn it into hydrogen, and then also to get the cost of electrolytic hydrogen so low on their market conditions and carbon taxes that it makes no sense whatsoever to take that gas out of the ground. But asking people to leave it in the ground while they can burn it is going to be a tough ask.
Yeah, and absolutely. And of course, for lots of industries, they don't have many other alternatives in terms of being able to fuel switch. So CCS-enabled hydrogen becomes important for those sectors such as sustainable aviation fuel for the aviation sector, the shipping sector. So it really is key for them to be able to decarbonise. Now we've got a question that's come in specifically for you, Eugene. So whilst you're here, we're going to test your expertise. Can you talk about the advantages of Johnson Matthey's low carbon hydrogen process technology linked to ATR, if you're able to comment on that today?
Yeah, so we have, I guess, accidentals or a historical advantage in coming up with this. So we had the building blocks for this technology before anybody was interested in hydrogen, because for purely economic reasons, we designed methanol units that use this technology. And quite simply, using these two units together means that we can capture all of the carbon dioxide from the process in the process gases, rather than having to heat the outside of the reaction vessels with natural gas. Whenever you get the carbon dioxide at high pressure and high purity, it's much cheaper to capture the carbon dioxide. So when you use the technology, the units are half the footprint, 40% of the capex, and have significant advantages in the kilograms of hydrogen that you get compared to the kilograms of methane that you need to put into the process. So at the end of the day, what are we interested in? Minimum capex, minimum OPEX, and the maximum amount of hydrogen for a kilo of methane, and the minimum amount of carbon dioxide that's released. This technology gives you all of those.
Excellent, thank you. We've had another question come in, and it's around certification and its importance in building confidence in the hydrogen ecosystem, achieving net zero. Now, Will, maybe you can comment. I know we've got the low carbon hydrogen standard, the LCHA that's been developed, so the business models that we're putting into place here are really quite world leading in terms of hydrogen development. Do you think that's the right way for us to go for certification? Is it working? Will it work? Your opinions? A difficult one.
Well, in terms of contract difference, low carbon hydrogen is more expensive than grey hydrogen. So the idea is that price differential is met with subsidy. That's the basis of the business model. The CCS business model, the regulated asset base. If we go back to the HyNet project, ENI in the Northwest have signed heads of terms on a world-first regulated asset-based CCS business model. So I think we're certainly making progress in this area. I think this is how the UK has decided to deliver these projects. You look at international comparisons, and IRA in the United States is very different from that, but in the UK there's a much more collaborative approach, I believe, between UK government and our projects. And I think that really is what we need in terms of bringing together a number of different stakeholders that are required to make this happen, in a sense. So it's going to be a very well-regulated asset-based contract for difference approach. So I think it's a good way to ensure that we can meet those targets by the mid-2020s and 2030.
And I think in terms of vestibility, it makes us a very attractive in the UK because we've got those business models, which are essentially backed by government. So you're reducing the risk for investors in that respect. Eugene, maybe any reflections on certification for hydrogen?
Yeah, clearly you can have, I mean, you cannot tell from a hydrogen molecule how it was produced, and it could have been produced, producing a lot, generating a lot of carbon dioxide. So I think certification is key here, because we've had grey hydrogen for many years, and you simply emit all of the carbon dioxide. So I think that being, everybody will want to have their say in what the certification should be. I think the absolutely crucial is certification is all about the lifetime carbon emissions associated with the hydrogen that's removed or that's produced, so that we can really focus on minimizing the release of greenhouse gases into the air and not on the politics of where the hydrogen came from.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for a few more questions. Okay, so another one on sort of challenges in developing medium to high TRL CCS, and maybe one for you, Eugene. How do we move those technologies further up in the TRL scale?
So I think at the moment there's a whole pipeline of technologies coming along the line, and low TRL. This was about high TRL, was it the question?
How do we move them up to high TRL?
How do we move them up to high TRL? There's actually quite a lot of money and quite a lot of finance on low TRL technologies, bringing them forward. Generally in Europe, the trouble is getting them from medium TRL all of the way to the top, because of the gap between the amount of money that needs to be put in before they actually get to the point where they're making money. I think it's an issue with the energy transition in general, is even looking at the really mature technologies. They will need, because of the ability of the world, or the ability the world has chosen to give to people to emit carbon dioxide without penalty, there is still a gap to these highest TRL, best they can be technologies standing on their own 2 feet. So I think that's the real challenge at the moment. There's really very little problem. Lots of people are being very innovative in the lower TRL technologies, and they're being moved up that pipeline. The blockage is at the top, not at the bottom.
And I guess having sort of market demand will also play into that. If we can see what the pipeline of projects are, what the demand will be, that will help us build out into the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to pose, it's around costs. We've got a few that have come in around costs. Have you calculated the cost of hydrogen? What are the wind curtailment costs versus hydrogen production costs? So I don't know if you're able to put you on the spot and say that, and maybe around funding as well. Is the funding sufficient for these projects to get up and running?
I guess you mean in the UK?
In the UK.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's going to cost tens of billions of pounds to decarbonise an industrial cluster. The idea is, with innovation funding, that we, award to our projects, we de-risk early market movers to be able to make decisions, and to, publish the lessons that they've learned as part of that process. We have a very big knowledge sharing program. So the idea is that this makes it a more cost-effective and efficient process of developing these projects, that if these early market movers can then disseminate the lessons that they've learned as part of that process, it will make it a much more, make it much easier and smoother and cost-effective for others who are going later to be able to develop their projects. So that's kind of my view from an innovation funding perspective.
I guess I could just add, a lot of this really is a question of what we value and what we're prepared to pay for. And it's just a month ago, there are 2 stats that came out at the same time, was that the combined profitability of the international oil companies over the last 2 years, since the Russian invasion, or the latest Russian invasion, was around $280 billion. And so there are windfall taxes being talked about. In one day, in the same week, NVIDIA brought out their quarterly results, which were a bit higher than normal, and its share price jumped by $280 billion in a single day. And I think the previous sessions here, we're talking about AI here. We need to not allocate all of the value to the AI part of the value chain, but a little bit of the value to the actual nuts and bolts that will save the planet. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. I think we are going to wrap up there. We're at our time, but I hope you'll join me in thanking both of our panelists today, and Innovation Zero for having us.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, Georgina. And if you'd like to ask questions or you didn't get your questions answered, the panelists will be on my left-hand side.